The day Grace Mercer rode into Caldwell, Kansas with nothing but a carpet bag, a loaded derringer tucked into her boot, and a letter of introduction to a man she had never met. The summer of 1882 was sitting heavy on the plains like a wool blanket soaked through with heat. She had answered the advertisement herself. She had not been coerced into it, had not been desperate in the way most people assumed women who answered such advertisements were desperate. She had been deliberate about it, the way she was deliberate about most things. The advertisement had appeared in the Wichita Eagle on a Tuesday morning in late April, and by Wednesday afternoon she had composed her response and sealed it with wax, and by Friday it was already in the Post headed west toward a cattle ranch outside of Caldwell. The advertisement had read simply, "Rancher, 32, seeks a capable woman for marriage, must be honest, must not be afraid of hard work. References required. Respond to Oscar Monroe, Monroe Ranch, outside Caldwell, Kansas." Grace had been 26 years old at the time she answered. She was 26 still when she arrived, because the exchange of letters had taken only 2 months, which she thought said something about both their natures. Neither of them was interested in wasting time. She stepped off the stagecoach and onto the packed dirt of Caldwell's Main Street, squinting against the afternoon glare that bounced off every white-painted storefront and tin roof on the block. The town was alive in the way frontier towns were alive, which was to say it was loud and dusty and smelled of horses and wood smoke, and something faintly sweet that she eventually identified as molasses from the dry goods store 2 doors down. Men moved along the boardwalks with their hats pulled low. A dog slept in the middle of the road, utterly unbothered by the wagon that had to go around it. A woman in a yellow dress was arguing with a shopkeeper about the price of calico. Grace set her bag down and looked at all of it with clear gray eyes and thought, "I can make a life here." She had told him in her letters that she would be a good wife. She had also told him in the second letter that she would not be an obedient one. She had expected that to end the correspondence. Instead, he had written back within the week, and his response had been 4 words longer than any previous letter he had sent her, which she had taken as a sign of enthusiasm. He had written, "That is exactly what I need. I have had enough of quiet women who disappear into the wallpaper. I run a cattle ranch and I need a partner, not a decoration." She had read that letter 3 times. Then she had written back and said she was coming. Now she was here, and the man who was supposed to meet her was not immediately visible, which was slightly irritating given that she had traveled nearly 200 miles by train and stagecoach, and the last 30 miles of which had been on a road that she was fairly certain had been designed by someone who held a personal grudge against human spines. She picked up her carpet bag and walked to the shade of the post office awning and waited. He came around the corner 5 minutes later, and she knew it was him before he spoke because he moved like a man who owned something. Not arrogantly, not with the swaggering self-importance she had seen in men who had nothing but wanted the world to believe otherwise. He moved with a kind of quiet authority, like a man who knew every acre of the ground under his boots and had earned the right to know it. Oscar Monroe was tall, though not unusually so, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of real labor rather than pretense. He had dark hair that was a little too long at the collar, brown from the sun, and a jaw that looked like it had been set with some stubbornness and never relaxed. His eyes, when he finally found her standing under the post office awning and stopped walking, were a dark amber color, the color of whiskey held up to lamplight, and they were looking at her with an expression that was carefully neutral. She looked back at him with an expression that was equally neutral and thought, "Well, all right then." "Miss Mercer," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Monroe," she said. It was equally not a question. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at her single carpet bag, then looked back at her. "Is that all your luggage?" "I travel light," she said. "I can acquire what I need." Something shifted in his expression, though she could not have said precisely what it was. He picked up her carpet bag before she could protest, which she noted, and turned toward the street where a wagon was hitched outside the land office. "The ranch is about 4 miles out," he said. "The road is passable." The road from the stage stop was not passable, she said, falling into step beside him. The road from the stage stop was an ambition, not a road. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, suppressed quickly. Fair assessment. They walked to the wagon, and he helped her up to the bench with a hand that was calloused and warm, and then he climbed up the other side and took the reins, and they started out of town in the direction of a horizon that was all grass and sky and heat shimmer. For a while neither of them spoke, and Grace found the silence comfortable in the way that silences between people who are still measuring each other can occasionally be comfortable, when neither person is trying too hard to fill it. "You're not what I pictured," he said finally, when the last buildings of Caldwell had given way to open grassland. "What did you picture?" she asked. He thought about it with what appeared to be genuine consideration. "Someone older," he said. "Someone who had already worn herself out somewhere else and was looking for a fresh start." "I have not been worn out," Grace said. "I am very deliberately starting before I have been worn out. I think that is the smarter approach." He glanced at her sidelong. "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri," she said. "My father had a farm. I grew up knowing how to work. He died 3 years ago, and then my mother remarried, and her new husband and I did not agree on much of anything, and so I made other arrangements." "What kind of other arrangements?" "I taught school for 2 years in Wichita," she said. "Before that I worked in a dry goods store. I know how to keep accounts, I can sew and cook and preserve, I can ride a horse competently, and I can shoot a gun adequately. I am not afraid of weather or hard work or difficult conversations." She paused. "I believe I mentioned most of this in my letters." "You did," he said. "I wanted to hear it in person, to see if I would change my account." He smiled at that, and it transformed his face in a way that was somewhat startling, because it made him look younger and less guarded, and she understood suddenly that the careful neutrality of his expression was habitual rather than natural. "Something like that," he said. Grace filed that information away and looked out at the plains, where the grass was bending in a hot wind that smelled of dust and something green and living underneath it, and she thought that Kansas was different from Missouri, flatter and more exposed, but there was something about all that open sky that she found she did not mind. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, and he did. He talked about it the way a man talks about something he has built himself, with a kind of careful pride that he was trying not to let become boasting. He had started with 300 acres and 100 head of cattle in 1876, he said, and now he had over 1,000 acres and 400 cattle and a bunkhouse where he kept 3 permanent ranch hands, a man named Elias who had been with him since the beginning, a younger man named Pete who had come up from Texas 2 years ago, and a quiet Cheyenne man named Thomas who had been working cattle since before Oscar had come to Kansas. He talked about the house he had built, which he said was modest but solid, and about the water rights he had recently settled with his neighbor to the south after a dispute that had taken 18 months to resolve through the county court. "You resolved it through the court?" Grace asked, because men in her experience did not always choose that route. "I am not a man who resolves things with a gun if there is another way," Oscar said, and said it in a tone that suggested this was something he had thought carefully about and meant completely. She looked at him again with new attention. "That is a less common philosophy than it should be." "My father resolved everything with his fists," Oscar said, and did not elaborate, and she understood that the elaboration was not necessary. They came over a low rise and the ranch spread out below them, and Grace looked at it with the same clear assessment she had been applying to everything since she arrived. The house was larger than modest, actually, though she suspected Oscar's definition of modest was calibrated against grander things he had perhaps imagined once. It was a good solid house of timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a kitchen addition built onto the back. The barn was well maintained, the fences were straight, the yard had been swept. There were flower beds near the front porch that surprised her because they were tended, not just struggling weeds, actual flowers, marigolds, and something purple she thought might be lavender. "Did you plant those?" she asked, nodding toward the flower beds. He looked almost embarrassed. "My mother came to visit last year," he said. "She planted them and then I kept them because they were already there." Grace looked at the flowers and then looked at him and thought that a man who kept his mother's flowers was a man worth knowing. "I like them," she said simply. He helped her down from the wagon and she stood in the yard and looked at the whole of it, the house and the barn and the pens and the rolling Kansas sky above everything, and she felt something settle in her chest that she had not realized was unsettled. This was hers, or could be, if they suited each other. "I thought we could speak plainly before anything is decided," Oscar said, and she appreciated that he said it, that he was not assuming the advertisement and the letters and her arrival were a foregone conclusion. "I think that is the right approach," she said. He gestured to the porch and they sat on opposite ends of a bench that faced west, where the sun was beginning its descent in colors that were frankly excessive, orange and gold and a deep burning pink. And Grace thought that whatever Kansas lacked in trees and hills it was certainly making up for in sunsets. "I want to be honest with you," Oscar said. "I advertised because I need a partner on this ranch. That's not a romantic thing to say, but it's the truth. My mother keeps asking me when I'm going to stop being a fool and find someone, and maybe she's right, but the reason I need a wife isn't loneliness alone. It's practical. I need someone who can manage this house, manage the accounts when I'm on drives, make decisions when I'm not here, deal with the hands and the neighbors and whatever else comes up. I had a foreman's wife offer to help once, and she spent the whole time deferring every decision to me even when I was 3 days' ride away. And by the time I got back, we had missed a water contract that cost us $200. Grace looked at him steadily. "And so you wanted someone who would not defer." "I wanted someone who would not need to defer," he said, "who would just handle it." "I can handle things," she said. "That has never been in question." She paused. "I should also tell you something plainly. I have opinions. I will share them. I will disagree with you when I think you are wrong, and I will tell you why, and I will expect the same respect for my arguments that you would give to any person whose judgment you value. I will not be ornamental, and I will not be quiet, and I will not become smaller to make anyone comfortable." She said it without aggression, simply as statement of fact, and watched him receive it. He nodded slowly as if confirming something he had already believed. "In my first letter to you," he said, "I wrote that I had enough of quiet women who disappear into the wallpaper." "You did." "I meant it." "Then we may suit each other," Grace said. He looked at her, and there was something in those amber eyes that was warmer than the careful neutral of earlier, something that was considering and perhaps even hopeful in a guarded way that she thought was probably his natural mode for hope. "I think we might," he said. The evening came down around them gently, and Elias, who turned out to be a weathered man of about 50 with a gray beard and the careful eyes of someone who had seen many different kinds of trouble, came to introduce himself and to report that the supper was ready, because apparently on Oscar's instruction he had started a stew, and the smell of it was drifting from the kitchen in a way that reminded Grace that she had not eaten since early morning. They ate supper at a kitchen table that was large enough for 6 and sat across from each other, and Oscar told her more about the rhythms of the ranch year, the fall roundup and the spring drives to the railhead at Caldwell, the way the weather could turn in an hour on the Kansas plains, the names of the neighboring ranchers and their various personalities, and the politics of water rights and grazing leases that ran underneath everything like an underground river. Grace listened and asked questions, precise questions, and watched him register that her questions were precise and that she understood the answers. By the end of supper, something had shifted between them from provisional to possible. He showed her the room he had prepared for her, which was small and clean and had a window that looked out toward the east where the stars were coming up one by one over the dark plains, and she thought that she would sleep very well here. "We should get married sooner rather than later," she said at the door, and he looked at her with mild surprise. "Not because of propriety," she added, "though that matters too." but because you need a legal partner, not a house guest, and the sooner that is established, the sooner I can actually be useful." He stared at her for a moment and then nodded with a kind of decisive motion, like a man who has been presented with an argument that is entirely sound. "Saturday," he said. "The justice of the peace is in Caldwell on Saturdays." "Saturday is fine," she said, and said good night, and went into her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, thinking about what she had set herself to, and found that she was not afraid of any of it. She was, in fact, something very close to excited, which was not an emotion she had expected. They were married on a Saturday morning in late June of 1882, in the front room of Justice Alderman's office in Caldwell, with Elias as one witness and a woman named Clara Hodge, who ran the millinery shop, as the other. And it was a brief ceremony that said the necessary words and no more. And when it was done and Grace became Grace Monroe by the law, if not yet fully by feeling, Oscar looked at her in a way that she thought was equal parts uncertain and relieved. And she thought that was probably exactly how she looked too. Clara Hodge, who was a round and kind woman of about 40, who had the manner of someone who considered herself professionally obligated to celebrate things, pressed a small bunch of wild prairie flowers into Grace's hands after the ceremony, and said that she thought Grace was the most sensible woman she had ever watched get married, and she meant it as the highest possible compliment, and Grace understood it as such and thanked her warmly. They went back to the ranch, and Grace put the prairie flowers in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill, and then she sat down with the ranch ledgers that Oscar had been keeping in a desk in the back room, and she read through 3 years of accounts in 2 hours while Oscar went out to the pasture, and when he came back for the midday meal, she had a list of 4 observations about his bookkeeping that she thought might save him money. He sat down across from her and looked at the list and then looked at her. "You read all of that in 2 hours. I used to keep accounts for the dry goods store," she said. "I read them quickly." She pointed to the first item on her list. "You are paying too much for the freight on your winter feed delivery. There is a different freight company that comes through Caldwell every month, and their rate is a third lower." He leaned over and looked at where she was pointing. "How do you know about that company?" "Clara Hodge mentioned it while we were waiting for the justice of the peace," Grace said. "She uses them for her millinery supplies. I wrote it down." She handed him the piece of paper. He read it and then read it again, and then looked at her with an expression that was not quite laughter but was somewhere in that neighborhood. "We have been married 4 hours," he said. "I know," Grace said. "We are already making progress." He did laugh then, fully, and it was a good sound, deep and genuine, and she filed that sound away in the same careful part of her mind where she had already filed the information about the flowers and the court and the fists and what he needed in a partner. The summer was busy in the way that summer on a working cattle ranch is always busy, which is to say relentlessly. Grace learned the ranch from the ground up. She rose before the sun with Oscar and walked the yard and the barn and the pens, learning the names and temperaments of every animal, learning the rhythms of the work, learning what Elias and Pete and Thomas did and how they did it, asking questions that were not the questions of a woman who thought herself an outsider to the work, but of a woman who intended to understand it completely. Thomas, the Cheyenne hand, was initially the most reserved about her presence, and she did not push against that reserve but simply did her work with consistency and respect. And about 3 weeks into her arrival, he came to her one morning at the kitchen garden. She had started behind the house and sat on the fence nearby and said, without preamble, that she handled a horse better than most men he had worked with, and she thanked him and they got on well enough after that. Pete, who was 23 and from San Antonio, and had the kind of cheerful energy that exhausted lesser people, adopted her with immediate enthusiasm and treated her as something between a ranch foreman and an elder sister, and was perpetually asking her opinion on things ranging from cattle prices to whether his new boots looked good, and seemed entirely untroubled by the inconsistency of the subject range. Elias watched her for 2 full weeks before he said anything to her directly, and what he said was this. One evening when they were both on the porch and Oscar was still in the barn working on a harness. "He's a good man. He's had a harder time of it than he'll ever tell you. His last foreman robbed him blind for 2 years before he figured it out, and before that there was a woman he was set to marry who ran off with a cattle buyer from Abilene. He doesn't say any of that, but you should know it. He trusts slow and he loves slow, but when he does it solid all the way through." Grace sat with that for a moment and then said, "Why are you telling me this?" Elias looked out at the dark horizon. "Because you're the first good thing that's happened on this ranch in a while, and I'd like you to stay." She stayed. She had not planned to leave, but she felt the weight of what Elias had said settle into her resolve, which was already considerable, and make it more so. July brought heat that pressed down on the plains like a great flat hand, and with it came the first real test of whether Grace and Oscar's partnership was as solid as it had seemed in theory. A buyer from Denver named Whitfield came to the ranch to negotiate for 100 head of cattle to be delivered in September, and Oscar was out on the south pasture when Whitfield arrived, and Grace met him on the porch. Whitfield was a smooth man, well-dressed, with the practiced pleasantness of someone who made his living in negotiation. He looked at Grace with the careful reassessment that men performed when they encountered a woman where they expected a man, and Grace looked back at him with steady gray eyes and offered him sweet tea and a chair on the porch, and said her husband would be along directly. When Whitfield, making conversation, mentioned the price he was prepared to offer, Grace smiled pleasantly and said that she would pass that along to her husband, and Whitfield settled back satisfied. And when Oscar arrived 20 minutes later, Grace managed to be present in the back of the conversation in a way that looked casual and was not. And when Whitfield made his formal offer, Oscar looked at it for a moment and then looked at Grace. She said, "I believe the going rate in Caldwell right now is about $3 a head higher than that, from what Jed Hartley got on his last delivery." Whitfield's pleasant expression flickered. Oscar looked at him with the steady patience of a man who has all the time in the world. "My wife keeps a sharper eye on the cattle market than I do," he said, and said it as a simple fact with no particular apology. They got the $3 higher per head, and Whitfield went away still smiling, which said something about his margins, and Grace thought that was an interesting thing to know about Denver buyers. That evening, Oscar sat on the porch and watched the stars come up and said, without turning to look at her, "You knew that number before Whitfield got here, didn't you?" "I had a conversation with Jed Hartley's wife at the dry goods store on Tuesday," Grace said. "You went into town on Tuesday. I needed thread and I wanted to check the post." She paused. "And I suspected Whitfield was coming because I saw his letter on your desk when I was tidying and the dates suggested he would arrive this week." He turned to look at her then, and she could not entirely read his expression, but she thought it was something like wonder, not the patronizing kind, but the genuine kind, the kind a person has when something is better than they expected. "I should have been here for the negotiation," he said. "Yes," she said without softening it. "Next time you should be, but today it worked out." He nodded. Then he said, "Thank you." "That's what partners are for," she said. The word hung between them in the warm night air for a moment, and she was very aware of him sitting 6 feet away from her in the dark. This man she had known for barely 2 months and married for barely 2 weeks. This man whose mother had planted marigolds and whose father had used his fists, and who had kept the flowers anyway and chosen the courts. And she thought that learning a person was the most interesting thing there was to do in the world. August came, and with it, a dry spell that had Oscar and Thomas and Elias and Pete working from before dawn until after dark trying to manage the water situation. And Grace managed the house and the accounts and the garden, and rode out to the south well twice to assess the water levels and kept a careful log of what she measured. And when Oscar came home exhausted and dusty and short-tempered, she did not treat him with extra gentleness, which would have irritated him, but with the same direct practical respect she always had which steadied him. They argued for the first time properly on a Thursday evening in mid-August. It was about the fall drive, specifically about whether Grace would ride with it part of the way or stay at the ranch. And Oscar's position was that it was not sensible for her to ride with the drive because it was long and hard, and she had not been on a cattle drive before. And Grace's position was that if she was going to be a functional partner in this operation, she needed to understand every aspect of it from experience and not just from what someone told her afterward. They were in the kitchen, and the argument was conducted at full volume, which was new between them. Pete, who had made the mistake of coming in for water in the middle of it, retreated so fast he nearly took the door off its hinges. "You are being irrational," Oscar said. "It's not about whether you can handle it. It's about the practical reality that a cattle drive is no place for someone who hasn't done it before." "Then how does anyone ever do it for the first time?" Grace demanded. "You did it for the first time once. Pete did it for the first time once." "Was it irrational for them to go?" "That's different." "Tell me how that is different," she said, and she meant it as a genuine challenge, not a rhetorical one, and he knew the difference. He stood there with his jaw set and his amber eyes working through whatever argument he had ready, and after a moment the set of his jaw changed because he could not, apparently, find a distinction that would hold. "You'll stay on the edge of the herd," he said finally. "You'll ride with Thomas, who knows what he's doing. You will not do anything Thomas tells you not to do." "Agreed," she said immediately, because she was not interested in arguing a point that had already been conceded. He looked at her for a long moment. "You are an extremely difficult person," he said. "You said in your advertisement that you wanted a capable woman," she said. "Capability is frequently inconvenient." He looked at her, and then the corner of his mouth pulled up, and she felt something warm move through her chest that she recognized, with a kind of pleased and slightly alarmed awareness, as the beginning of something considerably more than professional respect. The fall drive was 3 days out to Caldwell's railhead, and Grace rode with it, and it was everything Oscar had said it would be in terms of difficulty, and also everything she had argued it would be in terms of essential education. She learned things about cattle and dust and distance that no ledger would ever have told her. She learned that Thomas moved through landscape like water finds its level, always finding the easiest path, never wasting effort, and that his quiet was not distance but a different kind of attention. She learned that Pete sang to keep the herd calm, and that his singing voice was remarkably good for a man who was otherwise average at most things. She learned that Oscar, on a cattle drive, was a different version of himself, focused and unhurried and absolutely in command of the work, moving along the edges of the herd on his big bay horse with the same quiet authority she had noticed the first day she had seen him. She watched him and thought things about him that she had been carefully not thinking, and then thought that she might as well stop pretending she was not thinking them. On the second evening, they camped on the banks of a creek that was running low from the drought, and everyone ate beans and bacon and biscuits cooked over an open fire. And after the others had settled down, Oscar came and sat beside Grace, where she had positioned herself slightly apart from the camp to look at the stars, which were enormous out here away from any town light, so thick and close that the sky looked weighted with them. "You did well today," he said, and said it like it was a simple report, not a compliment requiring gratitude. "I made 3 mistakes," she said. "I startled a section of the herd twice, and I took the wrong position when Thomas called the direction change." 4, he said. "You also let your horse drink too long at the first stream, and she was sluggish for the next hour." She looked at him sideways. "You were watching me." "I was watching everyone," he said. "That's my job on a drive." "You watched me more closely than the others," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said. She looked back at the stars. Around them the cattle settled and breathed, and the fire crackled down to embers, and the night was warm and soft and smelling of grass and dust and the faint green water smell of the creek. "Elias told me," she said carefully, "about the woman who left and the foreman who stole." Oscar was very still beside her for a moment. Then he exhaled. "Elias talks too much." He talked because he cares about this place, she said, and about you. He wanted me to understand something. And do you? She turned to look at him, and in the firelight his face was plains and shadows, and she thought he was a very handsome man in a way she had been professionally ignoring for 2 months and could no longer entirely justify professionally ignoring. I understand that you have good reasons for trusting slowly, she said. I am not in a hurry. I am not going anywhere. I want you to know that, simply and clearly, because I think you have had enough experience with people who left that you may not entirely believe it when someone says they will stay. He looked at her for a long time, and the fire popped and settled, and somewhere in the dark a coyote called to another, and the plains answered with silence. I believe you, he said, and the way he said it, quietly and without performance, told her that it was not something he said easily and that he meant it entirely. She felt that warm thing in her chest expand, and did not look away from him, and he did not look away from her, and the moment was long enough to be something, to be the kind of moment that a person remembers the exact temperature of years later. Then Pete turned over in his bedroll and snored loudly, and Elias threw a boot at him, and the night collapsed back into the ordinary, and they both laughed. And Grace thought that was all right too. That was actually better maybe, because the moment had been real and it could wait for whenever came next. The drive completed successfully, and they returned to the ranch with the income accounted and the cattle delivered. And September came in cooler and kinder than August had been, and the prairie turned gold and brown, and the sunsets went from excessive to sublime. And Grace planted a kitchen garden for the next year with Thomas's quiet advice about where the frost came first, and settled the accounts for the third quarter, and had a long argument with Oscar about whether they should buy another 100 acres to the north that had come up for sale, which she thought they should do and he thought was too much debt. And they argued it for a week, and in the end compromised on 50 acres, which turned out to be the right decision. And they both knew it was the right decision, and that shared knowing felt like something important. The night they settled the land deal, Oscar came to find her in the kitchen, where she was going over the figures from the sale at the railhead, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her, and she was aware of him standing there the way she was always aware of him now, with a kind of full-body consciousness that she had stopped pretending was anything other than what it was. Grace, he said. She looked up. I would like to say something, and I would like to say it plainly because I don't know another way. I appreciate plain, she said. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from her, and he looked at her with those amber eyes that had lost none of their careful quality but had added something to it, something open and slightly vulnerable and very earnest, and he said, I know we married practically, and I know you came here with your eyes open and your reasons your own, and I have respected that. But I find that I have stopped thinking about this as a practical arrangement and started thinking about it as my life, and you are the center of it, and I did not expect that to happen this fast, and I'm not entirely sure what to do with it. Grace looked at him for a long moment, at this deliberate, guarded, careful man who had just said the most unguarded thing she had heard him say, and she felt the warm thing in her chest become fully and undeniably itself, which was love, the kind that had been building since a stagecoach ride in June, and a first argument about cattle drives and stars by a dying fire, and 100 small moments of mutual respect that had, apparently, done what such moments do when they accumulate between two people who are paying attention. Oscar, she said, I have been in love with you since some time in early August, and I have been behaving with considerable professional restraint about it. He stared at her. Then he laughed, and it was the full genuine laugh she had heard that first day over the freight invoice, and she thought that sound was one of her favorite things in the world. Early August, he repeated. Approximately the 14th, she said. You came in from the Southwell in the evening, and you had been working since 4 in the morning, and you were exhausted, and you went and watered your horse before you went in for supper, even though you were falling over. That was when I was certain. He was looking at her with an expression that was so warm and undisguised that she felt she was seeing him fully for the first time, without any of the careful reserve, just the man underneath it, who was, she thought, extraordinary. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his hand was warm and calloused, and held hers with the same careful strength that characterized everything he did. And she turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat like that in the lamplight kitchen with the accounts spread between them and the autumn wind moving around the corners of the house. And it was one of the most perfect moments of Grace Mercer's life. "I would like to be your husband in every sense of that word," he said quietly, "not only in the legal sense." "I would like that too," she said. "I have been waiting for you to say something." "I was trying to be respectful," he said. "You have been very respectful," she said. "You can stop now." He smiled, slow and full, and stood up from the table and came around it, and she stood up to meet him. And when he kissed her, it was with the same quality of everything he did, deliberate and fully present and completely genuine, and she thought that she had been right on the day she arrived, standing in the yard looking at the house and the barn and the straight fences and the marigolds. She could make a life here. She was making one, and it was already better than anything she had planned. October on the ranch was a season of tremendous industry and tremendous satisfaction. Grace was in her element in a way she had perhaps never been before, because everything she was and everything she could do was useful here, and in her previous life there had always been something wasted, some capacity she had that the circumstances around her had no use for. Here nothing was wasted. Her sharpness and her opinions and her stubbornness and her capacity for hard work and her ability to see a problem from 3 directions at once were not inconvenient qualities, but necessary ones. She and Oscar moved through their days with the comfortable synchrony of people who have figured each other out, which is not to say they were always in agreement, because they were not. They argued regularly and well, both of them too clear-headed to let things fester and too direct to dance around a disagreement. But they argued and resolved and moved on, and each resolution seemed to add another layer of knowing between them, and each layer of knowing added to the warmth that was now completely undisguised on both sides. The ranch hands adjusted to the new order of things with varying speeds. Elias was visibly pleased in a way he expressed through being slightly less taciturn than usual. Pete was delighted and made no effort to hide it, and occasionally commented on what a good match they made with the complete lack of tact that was his most consistent personality trait. Thomas watched them with a quiet attention that was, Grace thought, its own kind of approval. In November, Oscar's mother came to visit. Margaret Monroe arrived by stagecoach and announced herself by climbing down from it with the exact same self-possessed energy that her son had, except at a volume of about 3 times higher. She was a small woman about 60, with white hair and dark amber eyes that were clearly the origin of her son's, and she looked at Grace for about 30 seconds and then pulled her into a hug that was surprisingly strong for someone her size. "Oh good," Margaret said into Grace's shoulder. "You have a spine. I was worried." Grace hugged her back. "I was told I had too much of a spine for most occasions." "Whoever told you that was a fool," Margaret said, releasing her. "My son needs someone who will push back. He has a tendency to just close off and get on with things without telling anyone what's wrong, and he needs someone who will not let him do that." She looked at Oscar, who was standing behind Grace with the expression of a man who knows he is going to be discussed in the third person and has accepted this. "Does she push back?" "Constantly," Oscar said, and said it with an expression of pure fond warmth that made his mother look between them and smile in the deeply satisfied way of a person whose greatest wish has come true. Margaret stayed for 2 weeks, and they were 2 of the best weeks Grace could remember. Margaret was funny and sharp and opinionated, and had clearly given Oscar most of his better qualities along with some of his more challenging ones. And they got along immediately and with genuine liking, talking for hours in the kitchen over coffee about the ranch and the territory and the state of things in the world and anything else that came to mind. Margaret had opinions about everything and shared them with the cheerful authority of someone who had earned the right. And Grace had opinions about everything and shared them with the same. And Oscar sat between them at dinner and looked like a man who was entirely content. The night before Margaret left, she and Grace sat alone on the porch in the cold November air, and Margaret said, "He is happy. I have not seen him happy like this since he was very young. I want you to know that because I think it is important to know what a thing you've done coming here." Grace looked out at the dark plains where the grass was brown now and the sky was a hard, clear winter black overhead. "He has done as much," she said. "More, maybe. He is the kind of man who is easy to be with." "He was not always," Margaret said carefully. "His father was not a kind man. Oscar worked very hard to become different from his father. It cost him something." "I know," Grace said. "He has told me a little, not much." "He won't tell you much," Margaret said, "but watch him. He tells you with how he acts, the patience, the choosing not to use force when force would be easier. Those are not natural to him. Those are choices he makes every day." She looked at Grace seriously. "Honor that." "I intend to," Grace said, and meant it with everything she had. Margaret went back to her home in Lawrence, Kansas, and left behind a tin of cookies and a quilt she had made and a kitchen full of warmth that did not dissipate after she was gone. Winter came hard and early to the Kansas plains that year. By December, the temperature had dropped in ways that made the work brutal, and Grace bundled herself in everything she owned and went out anyway, because there was no version of her that would sit by the fire while the men dealt with frozen water troughs and cattle that needed moving to the sheltered pasture near the creek. Oscar found her at the East Trough one morning cracking ice with a hatchet and did not tell her to go inside. Just picked up the second hatchet from the barn wall and worked the trough beside her until it was clear. On Christmas Day, which fell on a Sunday, they sat by the fire in the evening, and Oscar gave her a pair of fine leather riding gloves lined with wool, and she gave him a ledger she had set up for the new year with a system of accounts she had designed that was considerably more efficient than what he had been using. And they both looked at their gifts for a moment, and then at each other and laughed because they were, apparently, exactly the kind of people they were. "I also have this," he said, and reached into his shirt pocket and brought out a small silver ring with a dark red stone in it and held it out to her. "I got it in Caldwell in September," he said. "I should have given it to you sooner." She looked at it. "September," she said. "That was the month after early August." "Yes," he said. She held out her hand and he slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly because he had, she realized with a rush of feeling, been paying close enough attention to know the size of her hand, and that attention was, she thought, the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. "It's beautiful," she said. "It reminded me of you," he said. "Something that looks simple and is not simple at all." She looked at him and thought that this man was going to surprise her every day for the rest of her life, and that this was the most wonderful thing she could imagine. January arrived with a blizzard that pinned them all inside for 3 days, and Grace spent those days doing accounts and reorganizing the storeroom, and having long conversations with Oscar about the ranch's future that ranged from practical planning to genuine dreaming about what the place could be in 10 years. And those conversations were, Grace thought, among the most intimate things two people could do: talk about a shared future with full honesty about what they wanted and what they feared. She told him about her father's farm, about the specific quality of Missouri mornings, and what it had meant to her to have grown up working land, about how her mother's remarriage had felt like a kind of dissolution of everything she had known, and about how teaching school had been something she was good at but had not been enough. He listened in the way he listened to everything, completely and without looking for the place to insert his own experience, just present with hers. He told her about coming to Kansas at 22 with $300 he had saved working on cattle drives since he was 16, about the first winter when the water froze and he had not known what to do, and Thomas, then working on the neighboring spread, had come over and helped him without being asked. He told her about the woman who had left, whose name was Adelaide, and said it in the way he had clearly practiced saying it, with the careful distance of someone who has dealt with a grief but not entirely forgotten it. And Grace did not reach for it or try to smooth it over, but simply heard it, and said that she was sorry it had hurt him, and that she was glad it had not made him give up on the possibility of something good. He looked at her with those amber eyes and said that he was glad of that too, more than he could easily say. February brought with it a complication that neither of them had anticipated, or more precisely a complication they had perhaps not thought about carefully enough. Grace missed the signs for 3 weeks because she had no precedent for them, and then she understood what she was feeling, and she sat with it for 2 days before she told Oscar, partly because she wanted to be certain, and partly because she was working through how she felt about it herself. She told him one morning over coffee, directly, the way she said everything directly, and she watched his face move through several distinct phases of emotion in quick succession, starting with surprise and passing through something that might have been terror and arriving at a kind of radiant, quiet joy that she had not seen on him before and that made him look entirely young. He reached across the table and took both her hands and said, "Are you all right? Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "I am a little tired and I am occasionally sick in the mornings, but I am well. Is there anything you need?" "I need," she said, "for you not to start treating me as if I am made of glass." "I am not made of glass. I will continue to do my work and live my life, and I will tell you if something changes, but I do not want to be managed." He looked at her, and she could see him physically restraining himself from the instinct to manage her, which she appreciated, because the restraint was real and visible, and she knew how much the instinct was genuine concern rather than condescension. "Understood," he said. Then he said, softer, "I am very happy, Grace." "So am I," she said. "I am very, very happy." He held her hands across the kitchen table as the morning light came through the window and the coffee went cold between them. And Grace thought that she had, without fully planning to, arrived at the center of something she had not known she was looking for, which was a life that fit her completely. Spring came to the Kansas plains with its usual extravagance, green coming back into the grass in waves, the creek running high and cold with snowmelt, the cattle restless and the horses full of themselves, and Grace's garden came up early and well, and she was larger now and more aware of her body than she had ever been, but she was right that she was not made of glass. And she continued to do her work and ride her horse and have her arguments and keep her accounts with the same clear determination that had brought her to Kansas in the first place. She and Oscar had a serious argument in March about a neighboring rancher named Caldwell who had been grazing his cattle on Monroe land without permission, and Grace wanted to take it to the county court immediately, which was both her instinct and the precedent she knew Oscar had set with the water rights dispute, and Oscar wanted to speak to Caldwell directly first. The argument was substantial, both of them making good points, and it went on long enough that Elias felt it necessary to take Pete and Thomas on a very thorough and prolonged inspection of the south fence. "If you go to him directly and he refuses, you have given him time to establish the habit," Grace said. "If we go to court without speaking to him first, we start something that will outlast whatever the immediate grievance is," Oscar said. "In a territory where you will be neighbors for 30 years, that matters." She looked at him. He was right. She did not want to say he was right because she had been building a good argument, but he was right and she knew it, and dishonesty was not in her nature. "You are right about the 30 years, she said. "You are right about the time giving him cover," he said. "So I go this week, not in a month," she nodded, "this week." He went to Caldwell that Friday and came back and reported that Caldwell had been embarrassed, had claimed his fence post had come down in the winter storms, and he had not realized, and had repaired the fence himself the following day. Whether this was entirely true or a face-saving story was less important than the result, which was that the cattle were back where they belonged, and Caldwell had stopped at the Monroe ranch the following Sunday to bring a small barrel of apple cider as something between an apology and a goodwill gesture, and Grace had thanked him warmly, and Oscar had shaken his hand, and the matter was closed. That evening, Grace said to Oscar, "I concede you were right." "You could tell me more specifically in what regard," he said, with a mild humor that was one of her favorite things about him. "About the 30 years," she said. "I think in Missouri I saw too much of neighbors who made permanent enemies over temporary grievances. You have a better read on how to protect this ranch long-term than I do yet." He looked at her with the warm attention that still, after nearly a year, made her feel entirely seen. "You'll get the read," he said. "You're already better at this than most people who have been here their whole lives." May came, and with it a letter from Margaret in Lawrence that was 6 pages long and full of advice and anticipation, and another letter from Grace's mother in Missouri that was more complicated and shorter but was, in its own constrained way, warm, and Grace wrote back to both of them, to Margaret with full enthusiasm and to her mother with careful honesty, because even complicated relationships deserved honesty. And she had found that maintaining them from a distance was easier than either abandoning them or pretending they were something they were not. She told Oscar about the letter from her mother one evening, about the complexity of that relationship, and he listened in the careful, complete way he had, and then said, "People carry the marks of what formed them. It does not mean they are unreachable. It just means you have to know where the marks are." She looked at him for a long time after that, because he had just described himself as much as her mother, and she thought he probably knew it, and she loved him for the knowing. June arrived, and with it the anniversary of their first meeting, and Grace made a note of it in her private way, and thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 1 year ago with a carpet bag and a derringer in her boot, and thought that woman would be pleased with where she had arrived, which was not only a place but a life, a full and purposeful and deeply satisfying life. On the 14th of June, 1883, Thomas came to the kitchen door at dawn and said with his usual economy of words that the cattle in the north pasture were unsettled, and one of the fences on the creek side appeared to be down, and Oscar was already pulling his boots on, and Grace was pulling hers on too, and Oscar opened his mouth and closed it again because he already knew what she would say, and she appreciated that he had learned not to say the thing he was going to say. They rode out together to the north pasture, and the fence was down, 3 posts pulled clean over by what Thomas identified as a young bull who had decided the grass on the other side of the fence was philosophically important to him, and they spent 2 hours in the early morning sun resetting the posts and restringing the wire while the cattle watched from a respectful distance. And by the time they were done, Grace's back ached in a way she noted carefully, and Oscar noticed her noting it. And he said nothing, but on the way back to the house, he put his hand on her back in the steadying, quiet way he had, and she leaned into it. She had gone back and forth with Oscar about whether she wanted Margaret to come for the birth, and in the end had written to Margaret in April, and Margaret had written back immediately saying she would arrive in June and stay as long as she was needed. And Grace was glad because Margaret was the kind of presence that made difficult things feel manageable. Margaret arrived on the 20th of June, and their son was born on the 4th of July, which Elias said was the most appropriate day possible, and Pete said was obviously going to make for excellent birthday parties. And Thomas sat on the fence near the barn and said nothing, but that the boy had a strong voice, which was Thomas's way of saying everything was well. They named him William, after Grace's father, and Oscar held him in the lamplight kitchen the first night with the careful awe of a man who is entirely undone and entirely present. And Grace, who was tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone, watched them from the bed and thought that this was the fullest moment of her life. Margaret stayed for 6 weeks, which was exactly right, because she was genuinely useful and genuinely joyful in the precise way that made her presence a gift rather than an imposition. And when she left at the end of July, she held Grace for a long time and said simply, "You are exactly what I hoped for." And Grace said, honestly, "So are you." The ranch went into the fall of 1883 with a new rhythm that accommodated William without being organized around him, because Grace was not a woman who organized herself entirely around any single thing, even things she loved completely. And Oscar understood this, and had arranged the bunkhouse such that one of the ranch hands was always within calling distance of the house during the hours when Grace was working the accounts or the garden or anything else that required both hands. William was an alert, sturdy baby who seemed to find the world completely fascinating, which Grace thought was the most promising quality a person could have. He watched everything with wide, dark eyes that were going to be his father's Amber eventually, and by October he was reaching for things with great purposeful determination. And Oscar sat with him on the porch in the early evenings while the light went gold across the plains and talked to him about the ranch with a quiet seriousness that made Grace, watching from inside, feel something so warm and full in her chest that it seemed almost too large for the space available. Clara Hodge from the millinery shop in Caldwell came out in November for Sunday supper, having become a genuine friend over the year and a half since the wedding, and she held William and said he was the most handsome baby she had ever seen, and Grace suspected she said this to everyone, but appreciated it nonetheless. The second year of Grace and Oscar's marriage was, if possible, even better than the first, because they knew each other now in the way that takes time to accumulate, knew the full shape of each other, the good and the difficult and the in-between, and the knowing had not diminished anything but had instead made everything more solid, like a house that has been through one good hard winter and is now fully understood. They argued in the spring of 1884 about buying a second bull, Grace in favor and Oscar cautiously opposed, and Grace won that one and was vindicated when the herd expanded by 22 calves that fall. She did not say "I told you so," not in words, but she did look at him with a very particular expression when the final count came in, and he said, "Yes, all right," with the reluctant smile of a man who is losing an argument to someone he loves and does not entirely mind losing it. Thomas's contribution to the ranch was a thing Grace thought about sometimes with care, because Thomas was in a difficult position in a territory that did not always acknowledge the humanity of Cheyenne men with the consistency it should have, and she had seen enough of how that played out in town and on the road to know that it was real and ugly and wrong. She could not fix the larger injustice of it, which frustrated her, but within the borders of the Monroe Ranch it was possible to ensure that Thomas was paid fairly and treated with respect, and had a say in decisions, which was not a sufficient response to an insufficient world, but was what was possible in the daily reality of the ranch, and she and Oscar both were consistent about it. Thomas, for his part, seemed to understand the limits of what the Monroe Ranch could be, and seemed to have made his peace with working within those limits in a place where he was genuinely respected, and this understanding was never spoken between any of them directly, but was present in the way they moved through the work together, a kind of mutual honesty about what was and what should be, held in the same hands. William took his first steps in November of 1883 at 4 months shy of a year, which Elias said was early, but which Grace privately thought was right on schedule for a child who had clearly decided to get on with things. In the winter of 1884, with William 18 months old and confidently toddling after every living creature on the ranch with complete disregard for his own safety, Grace looked at the life she had made and felt, with a clarity that surprised her with its totality, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had resigned herself to it, not because she had settled for it, but because it had turned out to be, in every dimension that mattered, exactly what she would have chosen if she had known how to choose it. She was standing in the kitchen one February morning, William on her hip because he was at a stage where he needed to be on someone's hip approximately 70% of the time, and had fixed opinions about whose hip it was. And Oscar came in from the morning work and stamped the cold off his boots and looked at her, and she looked at him across the kitchen in the early light, and he smiled at her. That full, genuine smile that had been one of her first and most important pieces of information about him. And she smiled back, and William said, with the authority of a person who had recently learned several words and was deploying them broadly, "Pa." Oscar crossed the kitchen and took William, who went to him with the absolute confidence of a child who knows without question that he is loved. And Oscar held him and looked at Grace over the top of his head and said, quietly and with everything he had, "Good morning, Grace." "Good morning, Oscar," she said, and it was the simplest exchange of their lives and one of the best. Spring came in off the plains, green and smelling of rain, the best spring they had seen since Grace arrived, and the creek ran high and clean, and the cattle were fat, and the new calves were more than they had hoped for. And the account ledger that Grace reviewed on the last day of March showed, clearly and satisfyingly, that the Monroe Ranch was in the most solid financial position it had been in since Oscar had started it in 1876. She showed it to him over supper, and he read through the figures with the careful attention he gave to everything she produced, and then looked up and said, "The additional 50 acres did more than I expected." "Combined with the new bull," she said. "Combined with the new bull," he agreed, and gave her the look that meant he was conceding an argument retroactively, which she had learned to recognize and which she found endlessly entertaining. They hired a fourth ranch hand in April, a young man named Felix who had come up from New Mexico and who had the best natural instinct with horses that any of them had seen, and who Pete adopted with the same immediate enthusiasm he brought to everything. On their second anniversary in June, Oscar came in from the evening work and found Grace in the kitchen and said, without preamble, because neither of them had ever been people who did things with much preamble, "2 years ago I drove a woman I had never met from the stage stop into Caldwell and thought that she was going to be interesting and possibly the best decision I had made in my adult life. I was right about both." Grace looked at him across the kitchen with 2 years of daily knowing behind her and William asleep upstairs and the accounts balanced and the ranch thriving and the marigolds planted and blooming again in the beds near the porch where Margaret had put them, and she said, "I drove into this town on a stagecoach with a carpet bag and a derringer in my boot and thought that I could make a life here." "Could you?" he said. "I made a life here," she said. "I made the best life I have ever known." He crossed the kitchen to her, and she turned into him, and he held her with both arms and she held him back. And they stood in the lamplit kitchen as the Kansas summer came in through the open window with its warm, insistent aliveness, the smell of grass and dust and something green and the sound of the plains settling into evening. And Grace Mercer Monroe thought that this was what it meant to be fully in your right place, in your right life, with your right person. She had told him she would be a good wife. She had told him she would not be an obedient one. He had said that was exactly what he needed. And then he had meant it, every day and in every way that mattered, had meant it so fully and so completely that she thought it was perhaps the most important thing any person had ever said about what they needed. Because what he had been saying was that he needed her, specifically her, all of her, the opinions and the arguments and the accounts and the stubbornness and the heart of her. And she had given him all of it, and he had given her all of himself in return. The careful and the guarded and the patient and the loving, and it had been, and continued to be, the most honest and most tender and most alive thing that either of them had ever been part of. 3 years after Grace stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, the Monroe Ranch was 1,050 acres of good Kansas land with 600 head of cattle, and a solid house with marigolds and lavender in the beds, and a kitchen garden, and a stable with 12 horses and 4 ranch hands who were the kind of men who stayed because staying was worth something. And in that house lived Oscar Monroe and Grace Monroe and William Monroe, who was almost 3 years old and opinionated and fearless. And in the second bedroom was a cradle that had been repainted recently, because Grace was carrying their second child, and had told Oscar so in the direct way she told him everything. On a Monday morning in October of 1885, while they were both looking at the accounts, He had looked up from the ledger with those amber eyes full and warm and said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "What do you need?" "The same thing I always need from you," she said, "which is to be treated as a capable person who is temporarily carrying additional weight." He had smiled and said, "You are the most capable person I know, carrying additional weight or otherwise." He had paused. "Is it too early to tell William?" "He will tell every living creature on the ranch within 30 seconds, she said. "Yes," Oscar said. "Then let's wait until closer to the time," she said. They told William in December, and he did indeed tell every living creature on the ranch within what felt like 30 seconds. And Elias looked at Oscar with an expression of pure quiet gladness that was as close to openly emotional as Elias ever got. And Pete expressed his delight at full and unconstrained volume. And Thomas looked at both of them and said that the house would be full, which was the closest thing Thomas ever said to excellent news. The baby came in the spring, which had become their season for everything important, and this time it was a girl, and they named her Clara after the millinery shop woman who had been at their wedding and had been a friend ever since. And Clara Monroe arrived into the world on a warm April morning with the same strong voice her brother had had, and the same dark eyes, and she was, all of them agreed, entirely herself from the very first moment. Oscar held her in the kitchen the morning after she arrived, and William sat on the chair beside him and looked at his sister with the utter solemnity of a nearly 3-year-old confronting something important and new, and then said, "She is small." "She will get bigger," Oscar said. "Like me?" "Exactly like you." William considered this with great seriousness and then said, "All right," in a tone that suggested he had weighed the evidence and found it acceptable. Grace, watching from the bed in the next room where she could see through the open door, laughed, and Oscar looked up and met her eyes, and the look between them was the accumulated weight of everything, of every argument and resolution, every shared meal and shared worry, every star-counted night and sunlit morning, every decision made together and every life lived fully. And it was the most complete and joyful and ordinary extraordinary look that two people had ever exchanged in a lamplit house on the Kansas plains. The years would continue, Grace knew. There would be more arguments and more resolutions and more decisions and more seasons, more hard winters and abundant springs, more mornings when everything was difficult and evenings when everything was golden, more years of the ranch growing and the family deepening, more of the slow accumulation of a life that was real and full and fully shared. William would grow up to be opinionated and fearless and entirely himself, would someday learn to work the land he had been born on and would do it well. Clara would grow up to be whatever she decided she wanted to be, and whatever that was would be met with the full support of two people who had built their entire partnership on the belief that a person should be exactly and completely themselves. Elias would stay for many more years, watching all of it with his quiet, weathered satisfaction. Pete would eventually leave to start his own small spread in Texas, and would write letters from there that were long and cheerful and arrived at irregular intervals, and always made them smile. Thomas would stay as long as it suited him, and when he eventually went north to be with family, that was his right and his life, and they told him so clearly and meant it. And he shook Oscar's hand and touched the brim of his hat to Grace, and that was the kind of goodbye that was also a kind of permanent respect. Oscar Monroe would spend the rest of his life being the man he had chosen to become, patient and honest and strong and occasionally stubborn and always, always present. The kind of man who watered his horse before he went in for supper, the kind of man who kept his mother's flowers, the kind of man who chose the courts over the fist because he believed that was what civilization required of its people, even when civilization did not always deserve it. Grace Monroe would spend the rest of her life being herself, completely and without apology or reduction, which was what she had always been and what the right life had made room for. She would keep the accounts and argue the arguments and plant the gardens and ride the horses and love her husband and her children and this particular patch of Kansas plains with everything she had, which was considerable. She had said she would be a good wife. She had also said she would not be an obedient one. He had said that was exactly what he needed, and they had both been right. On a summer evening in 1886, 4 years to the month since a stagecoach had rolled into Caldwell and deposited a woman with a carpet bag and a clear pair of gray eyes, Oscar Monroe sat on the wide porch of his house and watched the sunset do its excessive, gorgeous best over the Kansas plains. And beside him sat his wife Grace with Clara on her lap and William leaning against her side and a glass of cold water sweating in the heat. And the cattle were settled and the horses were in, and the ranch was still and full of its own quiet life. And he looked at all of it and felt, in his chest, the solid, unshakable certainty of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. Grace felt him look at her and turned her head and met his eyes, and everything they knew about each other passed between them in that look, all the years and the work and the love and the choosing, every single day the choosing. And she smiled at him with the full, clear warmth of a woman who had arrived in a strange place with a carpet bag and a derringer, and had made it hers completely. The plains stretched out in every direction, golden and immense and alive with wind, and the stars were beginning to come up one by one in the east, and the Monroe Ranch lay under all of it, solid and enduring and built by two people who had met as strangers and had become, through the daily practice of honesty and respect and love, something entirely necessary to each other. It was a good life. It was exactly the life it was supposed to be. And it was, in every way that mattered, only just beginning.